I was reading the new book, Man Soul Chronicles, to a group of about 80 kids at a camp. It's all very, Bunyan and very on the nose.
Yeah.
And I'd ask questions at the end like, who do you think God was in this story? And they're shooting up their hands, and they're all just so excited to make the correlation. Like, oh yeah, the dragon is Satan.
It's like we forget that kids want to know what's right. They want to know the right answer, and they want to be able to show what they've learned. Hello, Reformed mythologist Nate Morgan-Locke here with a conversation about Pilgrim's Progress and many other things. I am joined for this chat by Tyler Van Halteren. Tyler, hello.
Hey, Nate. Thanks for having me on here. I haven't followed your channel before, but I was scanning through it and loved seeing, I love Reformed theology and good stories, so it was neat to see the content there.
Oh, good stuff. Tyler, where are you currently based for this call?
Yeah, I'm just east of Toronto in Canada or Canada.
For our US viewers, that's the country just to the north of you, just if you haven't heard of it.
It is.
I'm kidding, of course. Tyler, let me get kind of straight into it. I came across your stuff through this little book, the Little Pilgrim's Big Journey, and then I discovered, in fact, you'd done a sequel to it, A Little Pilgrim's Big Journey. You're clearly a man who is excited by the works of 17th century author John Bunyan.
Yes.
What was it that made you think it was important to do another version of the Pilgrim's Progress?
Yeah, at the time, so when I was about 15, I read an old kind of wilted copy of the Pilgrim's Progress that someone had given to my dad in the 70s, and had just sat on his bookshelf for a long number of years, and that had a great impact on my early walk with Christ. So when my son was about 4 years old, I started thinking about that, and basically the two ideas of Pilgrim's Progress for kids were embedded in my mind and imagination, and so I looked around to see, and at the time the only one available was called Dangerous Journey. It was from the 80s.
Okay.
And had kind of sort of creepy images with terrifying, like Apollyon is terrifying, and there's lots of skeletons and skulls and things that a 4-year-old wouldn't love to read right before bedtime.
Yeah.
So that led me to create a version that was sort of ideal for 4 to 8-year-olds, with a bit more tamed down illustrations, children characters, and something that would really capture them and engage them. And so I'm grateful that it all came together.
Oh, fabulous. Well, I love them. I think they're just great additions. I mean, they're beautiful objects, just these hardback versions. That must have taken quite a bit of work. How long was it between you having the initial idea that you wanted to have a version of this for your son? He was 4, you say, when you first started thinking about it?
Yeah.
And how old was he when the final books had been bound?
Yeah, I was probably 5. He was probably around 5 or 5.5. So the illustrations, especially, what takes a long time.
And you've got a lot of illustrations in there.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the experience of taking a much-loved story, one that's possibly the most common book to find on a pastor's nightstand in addition to the Bible itself. What was the process like for you for just getting into the project?
Yeah, so first, just kind of taking the original text, putting in a document, and then sort of working through and trying to see which scenes were most important to include, which pieces of dialogue, and then kind of just I view almost all of my work now as sort of chiseling away at like a sculpture or wood or something, that there's a form that you're shooting for, aiming towards, and that you're sort of slowly chipping away. And especially with adaptation, there's that sense, but even with original works, there's a sense of you have an idea, but you have this blank sort of slate of a log or stone or whatnot, and you're just chipping away, trying to make it what you feel the Lord is calling it you towards, and leading that idea along. So I went in very naive to this project, and very not having a great sense of what in terms of I'd read a lot of books to my son, but I hadn't made or written a book. And so I continue to be amazed at the way that this book has resonated with people. But in some ways, the Lord just allowed me to chisel down Bunyan's work to a form that is very engaging for young kids. So that's been just such a sweet journey.
And did you grow up in a Christian family yourself?
I did, yeah.
I mean, that experience for so many of us who were blessed to grow up in Christian families of having our parents read storybooks and the Bible to us tucked up in bed. And I was thinking about it as a little kind of triangle. There's the parent, and then there's the child, and then there's the text. And there's this beautiful little relationship that takes place as you sit side by side and you look at the images and you take in the drawings and illustrations. They become incredibly precious moments in family life. Do you have any memories of those experiences when you were a 5-year-old?
Yeah, I think of them often, especially a mix of there's the Mercer Meyer books, Little Critter actually, which maybe I
Okay.
stole that from. I don't know if those are popular in the UK.
I've not heard of them.
Oh, okay. They're very popular in North America, but so those were just embedded in my imagination. I remember there's a distinct feeling of that excitement for a story, or when you get a new book, or the warmth of whether your parents reading to you or you're kind of hiding away in your own little nook and reading that book. That those kind of things, the feeling, the environment, the story, become, such a core memory,
Yeah.
and that comes back to me a lot now as I've especially these little pilgrim books that have resonated in a special way. Just thinking that that's becoming a part of thousands of children's imagination and memory and of their childhood. That it's such a wild and beautiful thing.
Yeah, it really is. My own experiences were, I just vividly remember all the Narnia Chronicles being read to
Mm.
me. It seems to me that there's a real interest at the moment in Lewis and in Tolkien and in the rest of the Inklings as well, in terms of the Christian imagination and the power of story and storytelling in the formation of Christian disciples. Has that been a part of your personal experience?
Yeah, yeah, definitely a huge part of my life and experience, and especially now as I've started this publishing company and am kind of imagining future books, I keep going back to them, to Lewis and Tolkien, and trying to think, there's something so distinct and so beautiful and so unique, and that resonates in those books, and I'm trying to uncode that, because like you said, those books just live on in your imagination, and both Christian and non-Christian, they've just become so deeply embedded in the culture that. I'd love, someone has said, "Why haven't you done a Narnia version?" And I'd love if they give me the copyright to do that, a children's illustrated version, or just
Yeah.
an epic illustrated version of Narnia. But that won't happen, I don't think. But although I've heard the Canadian copyright has some interesting clauses, but that's
Okay.
that's a different story.
Okay.
But
Well,
uh,
we'll see.
but but yeah, I'd love to someday. I'm prayerfully hoping to write a story that has that sort of same DNA, not like a fan fiction of those books, but
Yeah.
a new story that has that sort of same DNA,
Yeah.
as that kind of Tolkien Lewis, where there's a deep biblical worldview, a deep character in the book that. With sort of that epic fantasy background.
I think one of the things about the Pilgrim's Progress is that it's lasted, what are we on, nearly like 350 years now since Bunyan wrote, was it 1661 or something? And it seems like an important work of 17th century literature. It feels as though for those who are kind of really engaging with theological aesthetics and the work of the imagination and the work of literature, because it's allegory, it's seen as a little bit on the nose. But yet, I think because it is so straightforward, it's almost like it's so ideal for children because it's giving them that grounding
Mm.
in what it means, to become a Christian, what it means to live out the gospel. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah. That's I love allegory. I know Tolkien. I don't. Tolkien didn't love allegory, but he might have had different understandings too of that, like in terms of political allegory and different pieces like that. But I think there's definitely a huge place for allegory and teaching and discipling and fostering imagination. Where
Yeah.
there's a nice one to one. I was reading the new book Man Soul Chronicles, which is based on Bunyan's Holy War, to a group of about 80 kids at a camp over the course of a week,
Okay.
and it was hilarious to see. I thought the beginning there's a character called King Shaddai, and he's created this universe and this world called Mansoul, and it's all very Bunyan and very on the nose.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'd ask questions at the end like, who do you think God was in this story? And these are like 7 to 10 year olds, and they're shooting up their hands and they're so excited. And the
Yeah.
the Christ character is called Prince Emmanuel, and they're all just so excited to make the
Yeah.
correlation. And I thought like I'm gonna ask these questions, and I'm gonna look out at a room like of kids looking at me like, oh, are you dull? Why are you like? Isn't it so obvious? But
Yeah.
they were so excited, like, oh yeah, the dragon is Satan, like these kinds of things. So there's definitely something there to build on.
I think in some ways people forget how much children like to show what they know. And so if you explain things to children
Mm.
in a way that they can grasp very quickly, that gives them the opportunity to shoot their hand up and say, look, I do actually know the answer, rather than something which may have more long lasting imaginative power and maybe more stimulating for an adult reader. But it's like we forget that kids want to know what's right. They want to know the right answer, and they want to be able to show what they've learned,
Mhm.
and that allegory
Yeah.
helps kids to feel, hey, I've got some agency here. I know this stuff, in a way that maybe as we grow up, we like to discover a bit more for ourselves.
Yeah, and the other aspect of it I found fascinating as I've dug deeper, for the appeal to parents. And I think what's lasted, because even though Bunyan is so on the nose, the I think part of the what stood the test of time is the character development and the depth of the struggle he goes through. So none of it is trite, none of it is sort of fleeting or just like kind of cliche. Christian is genuinely thinking, like in the castle. What is it? The despondency or the castle despair.
Hmm.
He's genuinely thinking like, do I kill myself? And he's wrestling with that as they're facing hopelessness. Sorry, that's
Yeah.
the call of my my child in the distance.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, well. Never work with children. That's what they say. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the other books that you guys have published. So it's Lithos Books is the name of the publishing company you've developed.
Yes. Yes.
And you've got the Kingdom of God Bible Storybook, which again is an absolutely gorgeous edition. Again, that was must have been a huge piece of work to produce those.
Yeah, that one we were actually just transitioning from being missionaries in Cambodia to coming back to Canada, and my wife still calls me a little crazy for kind of I
Wow.
was at the tail end of that project while that was happening, so there's been a lot of transition in the season of starting this business in our lives, as kind of going to Cambodia and coming back to Canada, and so some
Interesting.
of it is a blur at times, but I feel like the Lord has carried along these works in a really distinct way, that
Yeah, wow.
the ideas get embedded, and I feel like a need to complete them.
So you're calling into Cambodia, you're calling onto the mission field. How did that come about? Just tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, I'd been there'd probably been since I was about a teenager, maybe around 16, had a sense of a call to missions, and
Okay.
so I had gone to seminary, and then I was a youth pastor, and then I went to Cambodia to teach at a Bible school there,
Okay.
and so was very had kind of been on that trajectory for a long time, and shortly into our time in Cambodia, I started to experience some significant health issues. Kind of battled through those, pressed through those for about 3 years, hoping kind of we could get some equilibrium or find some balance that would allow me to keep doing the work in Cambodia. But I found I was just ending up in bed a lot, sick, and so eventually it came to a point where it was
Oh,
like,
brother.
yeah, it came to a point I realized that it's time.
It wasn't just, I mean, this is a stereotype, but it wasn't just lack of maple syrup, was it? Was that the issue? If your sugar levels drop, that's an issue for you.
Yeah, no, it wasn't quite that. The ironically, the heat was a big factor,
Okay.
but that was to do with some autoimmune issues
Okay.
that heat kind of caused it to really. those issues to be worse than they would be here.
Well, we don't need to pry into those any further. So what year was it that you moved back from Cambodia back to Canada and were trying to complete these Kingdom of God volumes?
Yeah, that was in 2022,
Oh, right. Wow.
and I'd started the Little Pilgrim.
Goodness me, you have been a busy guy.
Yeah, yeah, we've kept them going. The part three of the Little Pilgrim books were written largely in there's an 11-hour time difference in Cambodia, and it was COVID as well, so we were stuck in a hotel for 2 weeks. And I had a hard time getting back into a schedule, so I'd just be up. The rest of the family would be sleeping,
Yeah.
and I just was writing Little Pilgrim Part 3, so that's the distinct memory of that one.
You used those COVID years productively, shall we say, in terms of this company.
Yeah, yeah, they were actually instrumental in our whole story because when we were in Cambodia, I was learning the language. We were busy. Everything was you're getting geared up, and I was like, oh, I don't know when I'll ever finish this Little Pilgrim book. And then, of course, COVID hits, things slow down, people aren't willing to meet up, we're kind of stuck. Language classes shut down, so then it was like, oh, okay, here's the season to do it, and people are at home as well, so it worked out that people were looking for great books, and everything kind of came in the right timing.
That's great. Tell me, what's been the reception of these books, whether the Pilgrim's Journey books or the storybook Bibles? What have people been saying about these?
Yeah, the big comment with the Little Pilgrim books is always that kids ask for one more chapter, just one more chapter. So that's kind of an exciting. All of them have 10 chapters in them, and so it's just sweet to produce books that are devotional, people can use for family devotions, but that the kids are actually begging for more. And it was kind of fun we did the first book, and then it was like, oh, people would just be cycling through the first book. So then when the second book came out, they're like, yes, we can add that into our cycle. So that's been the most encouraging part of it all, is seeing people come back to buy, the next books in the series.
And I think that's what is so tricky to get right with these kinds of Christian literature books, is that parents want their children to read them. They want to read them with their children because they know this is good stuff. This is good material. It's forming a good imagination. It's giving you truth. But then, of course, the challenge is that often this stuff, the kids don't want to read another chapter. And so the parent is constantly having to kind of battle with their child to do anything which is Christian literature, or literature which has got really kind of Christian element to it, or even just the devotional material as well.
Yeah, that's been one of the great joys of doing this, and finding there seems to be, my mind tends to work visually, so seeing a sense of the amount of words per page with the illustration and how that flows, so that there's a natural, the pictures are kind of telling a story. Even if a child is to flip through it on their own, they can kind of track with how things are going and the pacing. And so it's been kind of fun to see how that has resonated so well with families, that they, it tends to be, if they start with the Little Pilgrim books, then they're like, oh, hey, let's do Kingdom of God from this series, and they're from this company, and there's been a neat progression that way, where people are just, when we release a new book, the most common comment we get then is like, oh, I can't wait to complete my Lithos collection, because there's these books kind of resonate.
And I suppose for so many parents, that sense of trust, right? If I'm buying stuff for my children, I want to trust that this is good stuff for my children and stuff that my children are going to enjoy. And so for you as a publisher, trying to build that trust and reputation, is a major thing. And I'm guessing that's partly why you're called Lithos Books, because you are like the rock, right? It's the rock who is Christ, our Redeemer, but also these are solid foundations for children growing up in the faith.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I take that, all of that very prayerfully and seriously, that there is, like you said, I love that the triangle, that you're kind of partnering with parents in this to create books they can use. It's to encourage their kids in that way.
One thing that really struck me on your website was in your FAQs, you've got a question about having images of Jesus. I also have a kind of a reformed background in terms of my seminary background. And so the question of second commandment violations, we don't want to show pictures of Jesus because these can become objects of worship. The second commandment forbids us from making graven images and bowing down to worship to them. Just tell me how you navigated that, because as I say, I was quite impressed to see not only did you have a section on that, but also I think your arguments are very solid.
Yeah. That's been one we've thought about a lot and developed deeper convictions as we've thought about it more. So it's not just sort of on a middle ground, but although we understand people coming from the other side, that we feel very deeply and certain of our own convictions, which is good when you're producing books that are going out to loads of families. And so the big one is that Christ came as the image of God in flesh, and that it was very important for John the Apostle. 1 John, it's like he is very, very wants to stress that Jesus came in flesh. We touched him, we saw him, we heard him, and because the opposite becomes a road to different heresies and false teaching, where if Jesus was not a physical being, so that's one danger I see, where some children's books will put a light over Jesus' face, or will only sort of show his hand or his back. It makes him seem less human. So you see, here's Peter the apostle, and here's the 12 disciples and the Pharisees, but then he's less human than them. But he came as the image of God to show God to us. There was nothing specifically distinct about his appearance that makes it unseeable for us. People saw him and knew him. So there's that piece, and then the other big piece is that the second commandment, in its clarification, is for graven images that are representing Yahweh in a false way. So the Israelites setting up the golden calf and saying, "Look, these are your gods." There's a very clear false intention that leads to immoral living, that they go, and it says they rose and sang and went down to play, or however it phrases it, that there was a clear wrong intention that led to wrong living, versus is very different from a publisher saying, we want to explain Christ to kids for them to see the gospel, and so putting an image in a book that is representing God's perfect image bearer, that's the goal there.
I think that's so helpful. And it's interesting, in the UK, a far smaller proportion of people are concerned about images of Jesus. But in one sense, that's because they've never really considered that it might be an issue for people, or that there may be some connection between the second commandment and Christ as the image of God. And so it's helpful for them to see that the reason why it's okay is because Christ is the image of the invisible God.
Yeah.
Unless we think of Jesus when we think of God, that is when we're going to make an idol. If we want to picture God, we should think of Jesus, Christ, as the exact representation of the Father, and as the effulgence of his being. That really, that is why the depiction of Jesus is therefore going to be really important. And exactly as you say, I love that point that you can actually avoid the full humanity of Christ if he's not pictured in the same humanity that the rest of the disciples or the other characters of the New Testament are. So, as I say, I found that really helpful. One of the ways that you do depict Jesus, and I've tended to depict Jesus in some ways, is to show him from behind. So I've become slightly addicted to a thing called Rückenfigure, which is a German word which means figure shown from the back. And so I've got a whole video essay all about the prevalence of this particular compositional device showing a hero from behind, because the hero is the one we follow. And of course, Jesus says, follow me. Tyler, what do you find is challenging about the world of children's literature and storytelling for children as a parent?
Yeah, I guess it's getting that balance right of words. So taking deep theology, deep truths, trying to present them clearly, and you might say simply, but that's not always the goal. But present them clearly in a way that's digestible, or a way that's accessible, I guess would be, maybe that's the best. Taking things from the top shelf, bringing them to the bottom,
Yeah.
that without watering them down, without oversimplifying, without changing the meaning, but there's a way to do that that becomes clear. So right now I'm working through a book on called The Wisdom of God, with Job and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And so trying to take something like Ecclesiastes and bring it so that it's, distilled, still the same, substance in a sense, but it's distilled so that, because that would just be a maze that, a 4 to 8 year old would get easily lost in, to sort of try and find the essence. That's really the challenge that makes me super excited about children's books, and I think that's why we exist as a publisher, is just really focused on that, trying to do that, and that can be a challenge.
And when you're thinking about stories outside of the Christian literature, what are the stories that are out there and abroad in the wider culture that you're sort of concerned about, that children may be drawn to, that may be attractive to them, that friends are reading or their friends are engaging with?
Yeah, that's, I guess I'll address the Christian side first, and then the non-Christian side, because I engage most with Christian books. But the ones that concern me on the Christian side are ones that are more like a theology light, or, tend to hyper-emphasize, let's say, God's love without speaking of sin or repentance. And again, that all needs to be balanced, as the Bible does balance it. But that's what I found. And there's other children's Bibles that do this well, but with our Kingdom of God series, that seems to be what's most refreshing for people, as they find, this actually shows like the Israelites sin, and there's consequences, and it's called sin, and it's addressed, versus just, there's certain very popular storybook Bibles that would talk about Israel's exile, just talking about them sort of wandering away from God's love or something. When it's like, wait, this is the Assyrian army is being sent, and they're being sent out because of hundreds of years of rejecting the prophet's warnings and messages, and they're deep in sin, and so when it's just kind of, they've wandered away from God's love and heart from them, then that kind of weakens the gospel in the end, and God's nature. So that's one side, and then as parents ourselves, the most anecdotal, there's certain books like Diary of a Wimpy Kid, or things that our older son was like looking at, and then we started like to examine more, and we're like, hey, this is not like, it's just a fairly direct secular influence, because it's just essentially a diary of a kid at school, but he's the way he thinks about life it's very secular. It's not Christian in any sense of the word. So there's a way our kids can imbibe that, because the kid in the book becomes their hero. Like he is, even though it's a diary form or a journal form, he's kind of the hero of the story, but he's not in any sense a moral character. And I think it's probably a couple of months our son was reading that, and there was one time friends came over, and he was saying something, and we realized that's coming straight from the book, and he thinks that's cool, and that's when because we had to ask him, where did you learn that phrase, and so that he told, it was from this book. And so we looked deeper into it. We're like, hey, those are not books you can read anymore, because of the way that we feel they'll influence you.
And I think for many of us as parents, we're thinking about the diet of our children in terms of the food and drink that they eat, and how healthy they are in terms of whether they're getting enough exercise and all those sorts of things, enough sleep. And the diet of the stories you consume is clearly like a major influence on the way that people end up behaving. That our stories have this incredible power to shape the world for us. Stories are literally the way that we understand the world around us.
Mm.
I was also struck that, again, just looking on your website, you seem to be pursuing another John from England in the 1660s, whose last name is Milton, who wrote a book called Paradise Lost. So are you doing a Paradise Lost for children? Is that what's coming next?
I wish so there's there maybe someday I have some ideas, like a graphic novel idea about Paradise Lost would be pretty neat. I've been thinking about graphic novel as a form. I don't know if we'll end up verging into that someday. This is more. Sometimes I realize, like, oh, I'm only 34 and I have time. Sometimes it feels like I need to get everything done in the next 5 years, but I'm like, oh yeah, I have years, Lord willing, to continue to make resources like this. But graphic novel has been an idea that's fascinating me because that's becoming more prevalent in our culture. But so Paradise Lost with that would be neat. The caveat to that is John Bunyan was a contemporary of John Milton, and Holy War is, some have called it the people's Paradise Lost. So it's kind of a Paradise Lost told in an allegorical format. And I can't find any connections, anyone who validates this, but there seems to be a strong influence of Milton in Bunyan's work, like very, very clear in terms of the story of, the Holy War is talking about the fall of Diabolus, the Satan figure, and his temptation of the world, and there seems to be a lot of correlation between Milton's work and what Bunyan does there.
In terms of the illustrations, what's the plan for the illustrations for the Paradise Lost book?
That so the adult version that we've done has 50 illustrations from Gustave Doré. So we started kind of what we call the legacy editions, which is trying to basically just make the nicest version we can imagine of these classic Christian books. And that started with Pilgrim's Progress, where we scanned in like 100 vintage illustrations, and trying to recapture some of which has been part of our journey as a publisher too, which is really seems to have stuck out to people, is that using cloth bound and using higher quality materials and ribbon markers and good illustrations to try and recapture some of the beauty which originally inspired it was the old editions of Pilgrim's Progress. That's what got me on that, thinking, hey, couldn't we do this with a kid's book, make something that feels more heirloom type? And so that's the legacy editions are kind of that for more grown-up or teen audience.
Well, those Gustave Doré images are, in some ways, they've become sort of cliched to the point where people feel a little bit like, oh, I've seen all that kind of before. One thing that's excited me in the past maybe 10 years or so is that there seems to be a revival in people enthusing about a mythological view of the world. Seeing these images of the angels, the way that they're kind of drawn out in Doré's work is actually really powerful, and they deserve a second look. And I think some of this stuff that is part of our Christian heritage, as Reformed Christians, as biblical Christians, we're aware that God has been growing his church and presenting the gospel afresh in every age. And yet we can learn so much from the previous ages. And some of that work, whether it's Doré's work or Milton, and we can have a rich experience as we use those texts and those works of art for our own Christian discipleship, for our own family devotions, as clearly you've been doing with these books. Yeah,
Paradise Lost, the one thing that caught me off guard in a good way was as we went through it, the way he addresses the problem of evil in a narrative form is so compelling and beautiful that I didn't realize that was I noticed that as I was going through it, and then as I learned more about Milton, I realized that was one of his purposes for the book, was to make it a theodicy, like to justify the ways of God to man. And so when you see that played out, there's some of those questions we have as believers, why would God allow Satan into the garden, and those kinds of things that the Bible addresses, but not necessarily head on, or you can piece things together to find an answer. Milton addresses those in kind of this narrative form, and that's very intellectually compelling, and so that I found to be an unexpected gift of Paradise Lost, and kind of digging into these where someone has meditated and thought on something for so long and then presents it to you in such a compelling form that books like that can have, again, just as we talked about children's books resonating in a unique way, I think some of these books do that for us as well.
What is there that we haven't yet discussed that would be important for Tyler Van Halteren to tell the world about Lithos books and about the work you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, the big one, the most, we talked about it a little bit in this, is the Man Soul Chronicles, which is landing in the next week or two in North America. But this one I'm excited about for its because it's a fresh, story not many people have heard about, the Holy War. Like most people have heard about Pilgrim's Progress or have an idea about it, but I just love this book for its kind of ability to convey it shows both the deception of Satan and how he's at work in our lives and world, and then the beauty of the gospel in Christ overcoming. So as this book kind of reaches towards the climax, I did a bit of a spin on Bunyan's book, or I took some liberty on the conclusion or of the arc of the story.
Okay.
And but there's a really sweet, I think, moment near the end of the book that is unexpected but so clear of the redemption that Christ brings in the gospel. And so I'm kind of most excited for kids going through. There's 12 chapters in the book, but for them hitting chapter 11, where there's this kind of major switch I'm just really looking forward to families engaging with that story for the sake of seeing the gospel in a fresh light.
Well, that's a wonderful place to land. Seeing the gospel in a fresh light, the work of discipling our children and encouraging them with good truth and solid truth. And again, truth which is not just beautiful, but then beautifully told. And that really comes across in the work that you guys are doing. Tyler Van Halteren, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. It's awesome to be here and appreciate the work you're doing on this channel.
Please remember the media consumption is optional. You are under no obligation to read these books, though I would probably suggest it. I'm Reformed mythologist Nate Morgan Locke. I'm glad you are here.